Ladies and gentlemen, in 2016, the three Democrats on the Federal Election Commission voted to punish filmmaker Joel Gilbert for distributing a film critical of President Obama. Joel Gilbert.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cliff, and happy to be back here. I was here at the National Press Club back in 2012 at the conference where I introduced Dreams from My Real Father. And at that time, I presented a mountain of evidence that Barack Obama's story of his family background, the foundation of his candidacy, was a fairy tale, a total fraud. And in the film, I revealed that the foreign student and Kenyan goat herder, Barack Obama, was not the president's father, and that indeed his real biological father was the man who raised him, Communist Party USA propagandist and Soviet agent Frank Marshall Davis. As you can see behind me, it's almost unmistakable, the resemblance, while he looks nothing like the Kenyan Obama. More importantly, I chronicled Obama's radicalization by Davis. During his formative years, Obama's ideological mentor was Davis, so much so that when Obama left Hawaii for Occidental College at age 18, in his own words, he did so to study with Marxist professors. And Obama's journey into the little-known world of American Marxism was just beginning. Also at the 2012 press conference, I warned that America was in grave danger with a president hiding a secret family background because the truth would reveal Obama's radicalism, and this information could be used by America's adversaries. We can see now that Barack Obama's first term was characterized by extraordinary pro-Russia policies. Now, given the daily charges leveled by Democrats, it's time to take a hard look at what is probably the real Russiagate conspiracy. Was Barack Obama a Russian sympathizer, given his family background? Was Obama blackmailed or controlled by Putin? Let's revisit clips from an Obama-Romney debate and Obama at the South Korea nuclear summit in March 2012, where a hot mic picked up the voice of a deeply worried Obama. And I want you to notice how nervous he is when we look at this clip.
My last election, yeah. After my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir. I understand.
A few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda. You said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because, the Cold War has been over for 20 years.
This is my last election. Yeah. After my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir. I understand.
Okay, so what do we have here? In the debate with Mitt Romney, Obama is defending his pro-Russia policies, saying that Romney is out of date, being cautious with Russia. With Medvedev, you see Obama lean over and place his hand on Medvedev's right forearm, whispering, "This is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility." Then Medvedev placed his hand on top of Obama's and assured him, "I understand. I will transmit this information to Vladimir. I stand with you." Now, this is not a chilling exchange from a Cold War spy movie where an American president is being blackmailed by evil Ruskies. It was real. Obama was saying that Russian policy would become American policy if he would just get a little more time. In response, good cop Medvedev will put in a good word with bad cop Vladimir. "I stand with you." So this exchange was highly suspicious, and it was clearly the back end of an earlier unfinished conversation. Putin had been obviously pushing Obama for more concessions, and Obama was begging for time because Romney was holding him accountable for his inexplicable pro-Russia policies. Let's revisit those policy moves, which give us every reason to believe that Obama was under Putin's control right under our noses. Number one, upon taking office in 2009, Obama canceled the planned U.S. missile defense system in Eastern Europe that Vladimir Putin had bitterly opposed. Mitt Romney called this action a gift from Russia. Putin called Obama's move correct and brave. Just after Russia's clash with Georgia, Obama concluded a New START agreement that reduced U.S. forces, but Russia's were not reduced. Under the cover of the now famous reset, the U.S. set up a joint commission to transfer previously forbidden technology to Russia. In addition, Putin scuttled an agreement on disposal of weapons-grade plutonium with no response from Obama. The U.S. approved transfer of 20% of United States uranium deposits to a Russian-owned company, Uranium One. And best of all for Russia, Obama implemented a policy of American disengagement from the world, billed as leading from behind, which abandoned 60 years of bipartisan foreign policy consensus. Obama's disengagement policy fulfilled Russia's number one and most elusive strategic global objective since World War II, U.S. withdrawal. Absent American leadership in the world, Russia was left to fill the vacuum and tip the balance of power in its favor where it saw fit. Russia invaded Crimea and intervened in Syria, even setting up a military base with barely lip service from the White House. So why would an American president implement pro-Russian policies so antithetical to American interests? Where did Obama's true sympathies lie? What leverage could the Russians have had over Obama? And why was Putin pressing Obama for even more concessions before the 2012 election? Let's take a look.
My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats. My father grew up herding goats in Kenya. My father was from Kenya, from Africa.
Okay, my father grew up in Kenya herding goats, Obama declared over and over during his quest for the Oval Office. Now recall that Obama's inspiring story, backed by his autobiography, Dreams from My Father, served as the basis for the yet unknown Obama's candidacy. However, as I chronicled in my film, the tale of the noble goat-herding father from Africa was false. And Obama's dark secret served up the United States on a silver platter to Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. Vodka glasses no doubt clinked in Moscow as the Russians could barely believe their good fortune, because Barack Obama's real father was one of their own, Soviet espionage agent Frank Marshall Davis. Pull the file, they surely yelled, as their laughter turned into celebration and refills of vodka. Na zdarovya. The Russians had plenty of information on their man Frank Marshall Davis, as did the FBI, who had him under surveillance for pro-Soviet espionage and propaganda activity for 20 years. Now, who was Frank Marshall Davis? In 1930 Chicago, Communist Party USA, CPUSA, was funded by and took direction from Moscow. The white American communists in Chicago were on the lookout for prominent blacks to use as front men to bring blacks into the communist movement. They also sought out journalists to help spread their revolutionary messages. Frank Marshall Davis, a black journalist, fit the bill on both counts, and Davis became one of the first so-called black Bolsheviks, joining CPUSA in 1932 as a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, card number 47544. Davis began writing for communist newspapers in Chicago, and for the next 15 years, headed up a large number of communist front organizations. He even became a teacher at the Abraham Lincoln School in Chicago, a communist trading school. Following World War II, the Russians considered the US naval forces in Hawaii to be an obstacle to Soviet expansion in Southeast Asia. Davis was ordered to Hawaii by the Kremlin in 1948 to organize a massive strike by the Dock Workers Union, the ILWU, with the goal of taking over the Hawaiian government and expelling US naval forces. Davis's dock workers strike lasted 6 months and eventually failed. Davis stayed in Hawaii and became a writer for the communist newspaper, the Honolulu Record, where his columns flawlessly mirrored Soviet propaganda. He blamed American capitalism for starting World War II, denounced the Marshall Plan. He demonized President Truman as a fascist warmonger who was itching to start World War III. And anyone opposing communism was KKK, a white supremacist. He also preached government health care, citizenship for illegals, wealth redistribution, and nationalization of industry while bashing Wall Street. In his 600-page FBI file, he was observed taking photos of the Hawaiian coastline, and he was placed on Security Index A, meaning Davis would be immediately arrested in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union. In 1956, Davis was subpoenaed by the Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities and pleaded the Fifth, the only constitutional amendment that he seemed to like. In August of '61, there is overwhelming evidence that Frank Marshall Davis had a son, and they called him Barack Obama II, or just Barry, for the Kenyan student who agreed to the sham marriage to cover the affair. Now, in fact, Obama's career path closely mirrored Frank Marshall Davis's. The similarities are stunning. In 1930 Chicago, the white communists recruited Frank Marshall Davis as a front man to penetrate the black community. They thought blacks could be coerced if the messenger was black too. But the Chicago black community were no fools. They were largely hardworking, church-going Christians with no interest in Marxism, which was atheist. They were attracted to the Christian message of love thy neighbor, while the Marxist idea of war between classes turned them off. And when Davis arrived in Hawaii, he was famously kicked out of the Honolulu branch of the NAACP for trying to turn them into a pro-Stalinist organization. Now, flash forward to March 1983, at the height of the Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and Ronald Reagan, and Barack Obama was a senior at Columbia University. In his one and only editorial in the Sundial, entitled Breaking the War Mentality, Obama echoes Soviet anti-US propaganda, maintaining that America's war mentality is the source of Cold War tensions. Now, this propaganda was widely disseminated by the KGB at the time, that claimed that only if the US and the American people would cease with their war mentality, tensions would disappear, that the Soviet Union was the innocent actor while the United States was belligerent. Obama's breaking the war mentality was a clear indication of his early pro-Russian bias and the influence of Frank Marshall Davis, who wrote similar pro-Soviet propaganda for 30 years. US is the greatest obstacle to peace. Obama, breaking the war mentality. There can be no doubt that Davis radicalized Obama, so much so that Keith Kakagawa, Obama's best friend in high school, told me that Obama was a radical wannabe. A radical wannabe. 2 years later, 1985, white Chicago communists are again desperate to enlist the black community, which was highly organized around church groups. But still, the blacks were religious people with no interest in Marxism. Enter Barack Obama. Obama was brought from New York to Chicago by former weatherman terrorist Bill Ayers, whose father, Thomas Ayers, secured a grant from the Woods Foundation for Obama to head up the Developing Communities Project, a socialist front organization. And like his father before him, Obama became a frontman for white communists in Chicago, recruiting blacks to support socialist activism. Later, Obama headed up Project Vote, whose goal, in Obama's own words, was, quote, to organize blacks so the movement could take power, unquote. It was not to help black people. It was to take power. Still, the Chicago blacks were no fools. When Obama ran for Congress in 2002, he had little black support. His support came from white liberals and communists like Bill Ayers, who promoted Obama throughout his early political career. Meanwhile, the blacks still did not consider Obama one of their own. Obama worked on this problem a great deal by marrying Michelle Obama rather than his Asian American girlfriend, Sheila Jager. According to the new book called Rising Star by David Garrow, Obama ended his relationship with the Asian American girlfriend because, and she said, quote, Obama said, I'm not black enough for a political career. Later, Obama published his autobiography, Dreams from My Father, with a great deal of help from terrorist emeritus Bill Ayers, who helped him fabricate a childhood of racial discrimination, drug taking, and life as a street kid to try to gain acceptance. Obama lost badly in the congressional election anyway to Bobby Rush. He later would finally gained the support of the black community nationwide with his inspiring tale of a distant African father, repeated ad nauseum by the mainstream media without question, and the black community finally bought in. So Barack Obama, Barry, as I call him, followed both the ideological path and actual career path of Frank Marshall Davis. Both were recruited and propped up by white communists seeking to use the black community, and both made it a lifelong passion to undermine the United States at home and abroad. Who were these white Chicago communists who promoted Obama beginning in the 80s? These were the former leaders of the SDS and Marxist terrorist group, the Weather Underground, whose members returned to Chicago in the early 80s after being released from prison or coming out of hiding. Back in the 60s, they had an evil plan. They were not an anti-Vietnam protest movement. They were attempting to overthrow the government of the United States. The Weather Underground followed Mao Zedong's philosophy, a single spark can start a prairie fire. The idea was that if a few terrorists committed murder and mayhem, the working classes would rise up and demand communism. They would storm the Capitol just as the Bolsheviks had done. A single spark can start the fire. So they planted bombs at the Pentagon, they murdered policemen, believing this would be a successful path to communism. In their manifesto of the same name, Prairie Fire, written by Bill Ayers, the United States would then be divided into 4 sections. It would be occupied by armies of Cuba, Vietnam, and the Soviet Union, and China. And according to the late Larry Grathwohl, who was an FBI informant, the Weathermen's plan was to put 50 million Americans into re-education camps, just like in China, where about 25 million would likely have to be terminated for refusing communism. The plan was so evil, it didn't work. It turned people off. It failed so badly, most of these terrorists went to jail or disappeared. But when they emerged from prison or cut deals to leave the underground in the early 80s, they resettled back into Chicago and immersed themselves into educational institutions and foundations, and they even created their own socialist training school called the Midwest Academy. Now, Bill Ayers and the other radicals like Bernardine Dohrn, Mike Klonsky, and others then went about teaching the new generation of young radicals like Barack Obama the bitter lesson they had learned, that open revolution could never work. It was impossible to overthrow the government from the outside. You could not look people in the eye and say, I want to take your property and murder your neighbors. It didn't work. Instead, they taught that for the revolution to succeed, you must keep your socialism a secret. Don't tell anyone about your Marxism. Just look people in the eye and tell them you want to help families. Tell them you want to give them free health care. You want fairness. You believe in problem solving. And you just want change. Then they taught them after you take power, throw the voters under the bus and pursue the radical agenda that no one voted for. Stealth Marxism. Now, it took another 25 years, and I think the plan succeeded. This is the story of how American socialism went from terrorism and open calls for communist revolution in the 60s to the stealth socialism that continues to this day. Using a stealth strategy, progressives, which they now call themselves, slowly took over the Democrat Party. And today the Democrat Party is a radical socialist party. Because of its stealth nature, most Democrats, voters, do not understand their agenda, nor what Obama meant when he called for fundamentally transforming America. Nor do they understand what Bernie Sanders means when he calls for a political revolution. Now, back in 2007, of course, Obama burst on the scene. No one knew who he was. He introduced himself as a middle-of-the-road mainstream candidate. He emphasized his unique background, the son of a foreign student, a Kenyan goat herder, and a woman from Kansas. Obama explained that he was a constitutional law professor. He would obey the Constitution. He would cut the deficit in half, that marriage was between a man and a woman and God, and that he was a Christian. He would support Israel. He believed in a strong defense. And more than anything, he said he would be extremely transparent. He would also reach out to Republicans. A man above politics. It was all a lie. Obama had no intention of doing any of those things. He was following the plan of stealth socialism, intentionally manipulating the electorate into believing he would pursue mainstream policies when in fact his plan was a radical agenda that no one voted for. It was an assault on American democracy and an interference in a cherished and fair, free election system where the public chooses between two candidates and their true agendas. Now, immediately upon becoming president and taking office, according to plan, Obama began executing his radical agenda. He implemented his pro-Russia policies. He appointed those with communist backgrounds to top positions, like CIA Director James Brennan, who had voted communist, David Axelrod. Both his parents were Communist Party members. Valerie Jarrett became a top advisor. Her father-in-law, Vernon Jarrett, was a colleague of Frank Marshall Davis on the Chicago communist newspapers. Obama went to Cairo and told the Muslim world that America was founded on the principles of Islam, and that as president he would defend Islam. He forced through the Obamacare Act with no Republican input and made it a tax. He attacked, of course, Fox News and spied on the Associated Press, came out in support of gay marriage. He ran up the deficit. He accused Americans again and again of being racist. He appointed leftist radicals to the Supreme Court and every level of government. Obama then politicized the Justice Department from the get-go. There would be no prosecution for the new Black Panthers who intimidated voters. There were cover-ups, fast and furious, in Benghazi. Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood terrorist, was just workplace violence. He had a bad day at the office. Obama apologized to America's enemies at home and abroad. And he began a series of attacks on the police, recall beginning with the Harvard professor incident where he called the police stupid. Within a very short time, despite the media whitewash, the public got it. The American electorate understood that everything about Obama was a lie. He was the radical in chief that Stanley Kurtz wrote about. And a grassroots movement quickly developed in response, the Tea Party. It brought about a Republican sweep of congressional and Senate races in 2010, and they fully expected to expel Obama from office in 2012. Now, in 1940, we know French traveler Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in his book, Democracy in America, this great quote, "Everyone in America has the vote, and thus is a contributor to lawmaking. Anyone wishing to attack the law is thus reduced to adopting one of two courses. They must either change the nation's opinion or trample its wishes underfoot." Obama did trample. He interfered in the 2012 Democratic election process by unleashing the IRS against the Tea Party movement and conservative organizations, and me. This prevented conservatives from organizing in 2012, while the left was allowed to exercise free speech unhindered. There was no need for Russian interference in 2012, Cliff. We had our own Bolshevik in the White House, doing as the communists always do. They used the tools of state to maintain power, the secret police, or in this case, the IRS. Now, Obama's second term gave us more pro-Russia action, starting with the Iran nuclear deal. Obama bolstered Russia's ally Iran with his nuclear agreement without the consent of Congress and continued to crack down on US fossil fuels, bolstering Russia's oil industry. Now, what better proof of Obama's radicalism than the results for the black community? As illustrated in my 2014 film, There's No Place Like Utopia, for black communities in Chicago and nationwide, everything got worse under Obama. They were just getting poorer, they told me, from jobs to crime to single-parent families and drug cultures to poor education. For Obama, black lives didn't matter. Only red lives mattered. He pursued the Marxist agenda at the expense of the black community. The African Americans I spoke with in the film, and you should watch it if you haven't seen it, they were against illegals coming into their communities and driving down wages and taking jobs. They were against the legalization of drugs. They did not want drug dealers set free back in their communities. They did not want their daughters in public restrooms with men. They did not want higher payroll taxes and local businesses driven out of their communities with high taxes. They did not want manufacturing jobs going to Southeast Asia. They wanted more police in their community. They were not against the cops like Obama. Now, when Trump was elected last year, recall about 2 million anti-democracy protesters took to the streets as the leading Democrats in the country called for resistance. Now, resistance is a military term, not a democratic term. In a democracy, the term is opposition, which means opposing opinion. Resistance is a call to violence. Resistance was the term used by anti-Nazi partisans in World War II, and it's today used by Islamist terror groups like Hamas to oppose Israel. Resistance. This violent rhetoric of the left, not surprisingly, led to liberal violence, such as the attempted assassination of leading Republican lawmakers by a left-wing activist, James Hodgkinson, where Steve Scalise was gravely injured. And I call on all Democrat leaders and their voters to stop the violent rhetoric and respect the democratic process and the will of the voters. With Republicans in control of the three branches of government, America expects that long overdue investigations by Congress, the Justice Department, or a special prosecutor must begin. First, they should investigate Obama's background. While the mainstream media was repeating Obama's tall tales of a Kenyan goat herder, Barack Obama gave the Russians the power to expose him as a fraud and upend his chances for re-election. To think the age-old art of blackmail would not have been used by the Russians against President Obama would be naive. Second, they must investigate and prosecute the interference in the 2012 elections by Obama, Eric Holder, Lois Lerner, and others. Third, we should have an open, ongoing investigation about liberal violence against police, property, and incitement to violence by Democrat leaders who call for resistance against democracy. Fourth, we should investigate the left and its alliance with radical Islam. The Daily Mail reported that Antifa leaders met with ISIS leaders in Germany recently. These movements have a lot in common. They both view free markets, free speech, and democracy as an obstacle to taking power, and therefore the number one mutual target. Both the left and ISIS have a passion for destruction. They especially love to destroy historic monuments. Both would love very much to push the button together to blow up around Mount Rushmore. By destroying monuments, these movements erase history. For the left and ISIS, they want to remove the connection of the people to the land, leaving them vulnerable to new radical ideologies. As Michelle Obama famously said, we are going to change our history. Obama did his part by illegally confiscating millions of acres of land from states and giving it to the federal government, and you can recall him renaming Mount McKinley. This week marks 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Lenin's coup, where the fantasy of the perfect world, achieved through abolishing free markets and private property, began its long, murderous trail of destruction, misery, and suffering. Over 100 million people were murdered in peacetime by their own governments because they didn't accept communism. In Cambodia, they murdered everyone with glasses. Because if you had glasses, it means you had read. And they wanted to create a new humanity who only knew communism. Does America know better? Is America immune from falling under this disastrous ideology of destruction? Let's revisit recent statements of two Marxist politicians we know.
And here is a New Year's resolution that I will keep if elected president, and that is, if Wall Street does not end its greed, we will end it for them.
We cannot continue to rely only on our military in order to achieve the national security objectives that we've set. We've got to have a civilian national security force that's just as powerful, just as strong, just as well funded.
not only will big banks not be too big to fail, but big-time bankers will not be too big to jail.
Okay, now, Obama said he wanted a civilian national security force, maybe just like the Stasi in East Germany or maybe the Savak. Sounds like a police state. And did you see everyone clapped? They had no idea what he was talking about, but they clapped and they voted for him twice. This wasn't Obama's only moment that his Marxism burst out. Sometimes he couldn't contain it. If you can remember, of working class Americans, Obama said they cling to their guns and religion, or I want to spread the wealth around, and we will reward our friends and punish our enemies. And of course, we are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming America. Then you have Bernie Sanders talking about breaking up businesses. He wants to break up the banks, the pharmaceutical companies, and he wants to put businessmen in jail. This is what the Bolsheviks did. This was the beginning of the path of destruction 100 years ago, when the Bolsheviks jailed what they called at that time the bourgeois, what we call today entrepreneurs. And the government bureaucrats took over the economy. Unproductive state bureaucrats became the leading class of society. Within a few years, there was no productivity, no jobs, starvation, no food. But last year, Americans showed up to Bernie Sanders rallies by the thousands, and they were clapping. They had no idea what he was talking about, and they voted for him. So despite the recent electoral success of America First Donald Trump, I look out the window of my office in Southern California every day, where I have a clear view of the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, and I recall Ronald Reagan's profound words. Freedom is a fragile thing. It is never more than one generation away from extinction. Freedom must be fought for, protected, and handed on to the next generation to do the same. Thank you very much, and may God bless America.